All right, let's get right into it. On October 9th, 2025, that's the day President Bola Tinubu grants clemency to 175 people all across Nigeria. But who was on this list? We are talking about people convicted of murder, drug traffickers, illegal miners, even corruption. And one name, it just jumped off the page. Maryam Sanda. You remember her, the woman who was sentenced to death for stabbing her husband, Bello, to death back in 2017. Well, within hours, social media just erupted across the whole country. We saw hashtags like Justice for Bilayimu and all the related terms trending everywhere. I'm talking about on X, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Nigerians were all over the place asking really just one question. Whose mercy is this? Now, this wasn't just a 24-hour thing. For nearly 3 weeks, the outrage just got more and more intense because the victims' families started speaking out. You had civil society groups condemning the move. The opposition leader, Atiku Abubakar, he just called it an act of shame. Now, legal experts started warning that these pardons were undermining the rule of law. Even the drug enforcement agencies, they are watching as years of their work just seem to be undermined. The message from the public was crystal clear. They were not satisfied. Then on October 28, the presidency does a complete 180, a dramatic U-turn. In a revised announcement, President Tinubu excludes drug traffickers, kidnappers, human traffickers, and fraudsters from that pardon list. Maryam Sanda's case, that was revised too. Now, instead of a full pardon, her death sentence was commuted down to a reduced term. The final revised list, well, reports they vary somewhere between 86 and 120 beneficiaries, a lot less than the original 175. The government said it was, responding to public concerns, but the critics, they weren't satisfied. They started asking, if this reversal was so necessary, how did that original list get approved in the first place? And can you even reverse a presidential pardon under the Nigerian law? See, this episode isn't just about one controversial list. This is about power. It's about justice. It's about accountability in Nigeria's democracy. It's about what happens when mercy collides head-on with public outrage. And it's about these bigger questions facing Africa's most populous nation. Who benefits when the system bends? Who pays the price when justice feels selective? And what does this whole saga reveal about Nigeria's credibility, not just at home, but on the global stage? In this episode, we are going to dive deep into how Nigeria reacted to Tinubu's pardon list, how that reversal came to be, and exactly why this moment matters for justice, for governance, and for Nigeria's future. Let's get into it. So, what do a convicted murderer, a bunch of drug traffickers, and illegal miners all have in common? They all got presidential pardons or clemency on the exact same day, October 9th, 2025. The announcement, it came straight from the State House in Abuja. President Tinubu was exercising his constitutional power, no questions, no doubt about that. This is Section 175 of the 1999 Constitution, and he granted clemency to 175 people. On paper, it looked like compassion. There is this committee, the Presidential Advisory Committee on Prerogative of Mercy. They had recommended these individuals, and they had criteria, right? Remorse, good conduct in prison, vocational skills they might have learned, old age, ill health, all that stuff. Now, the presidency was framing this as giving second chances to people who had reformed. But when Nigerians actually saw the names on that list, compassion was not the first reaction. There was Maryam Sanda. We just talked about her, the woman who stabbed her husband, Bilayimu Bello, to death in their Abuja home back in 2017. She has been sentenced to death by hanging back in 2020, and the Court of Appeal upheld it. And now, she was initially granted clemency, like let off the hook, like pardoned by the Nigerian presidency. Now, there was Farouk Lawan, the former lawmaker, you will remember him convicted in that big fuel subsidy corruption case. And reports were indicating that drug offenders, they made up a significant part of this list. And this is all happening in a country that is facing serious drug challenges. Now, the criteria, they sounded reasonable on paper: remorse, good conduct, vocational training. But looking at the names, a lot of Nigerians saw something else. They saw connections, they saw privilege. While the presidency was calling it mercy, social media had a different name for it: impunity. The initial announcement, it says some people got full pardons, others had their sentences commuted, some death row inmates had their sentences reduced. It was one of the largest single exercise of presidential clemency in recent Nigeria history. The list was out. The presidency defended it as mercy. But within hours, Nigerians had a very different reaction. Many of them, they just felt betrayed. And what started as criticism on social media, well, that was about to turn into this massive public outcry, one that would force the country's leader to reconsider. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. First, let's look at how social media became this platform for a national debate. Look, when we talk about the age of social media, public opinion doesn't wait for some official channel, because within 24 hours of that pardon announcement, Nigerians had already expressed their verdict, and it was overwhelmingly critical. Hashtags started trending everywhere. Justice for Bilyaminu, that became the rallying cry, honoring the memory of Maryam Sanda's murdered husband. Nigerians were using all kinds of hashtags to just show their opposition to what they saw as impunity. And these conversations, they dominated X, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok for days. Members of Bilyaminu Bello's family, they came out and expressed their opposition to the pardon. They described it as painful, as unjust to those who had been seeking accountability. Now, Maryam Sanda's father-in-law, Ahmed Bello, he did publicly state that he had accepted the pardon in good faith. But other family members, they made it very clear they did not agree with that decision. Former Senator Dino Melaye, he was one of the very vocal critics on social media. He was questioning the pardoning of drug offenders, arguing it just undermined all the drug enforcement efforts in the country. His posts were getting shared everywhere, just amplifying the whole public discussion. And the reactions, they seem to vary across the country. In urban centers, especially in the south, you saw a lot of activity on X and Instagram. I'm talking about lawyers, activists, public figures all joining the criticism. Nigerian diaspora communities, they also expressed a lot of concern about the message this was sending, about Nigeria's justice system, about its governance standards. Over on TikTok, users were using humor, using satire to criticize the pardons. Some videos were suggesting that these pardoned individuals, they might be, mobilized for political purposes. So, while Maryam Sanda, convicted of murder, was getting clemency, Sunday Jackson, he remained on death row. Now, Jackson, he's a farmer from Adamawa State. He was sentenced to death for killing someone he claimed was attacking him. And despite appeals from religious organizations like the Pentecostal Fellowship of Nigeria, Jackson's case hadn't gotten the same kind of consideration. That contrast, it just raised huge questions about equity, about fairness in the whole clemency process. The digital response was clear, but the question was, would those in authority actually respond? I mean, sometimes social media criticism just fade away, but this time felt different. Civil society groups, human rights organizations, the political opposition, they were all preparing their formal responses. And what they had to say, that was about to intensify the pressure on the presidency. So look, when Amnesty International comes out and criticizes your clemency exercise, say it's potentially undermining the rule of law, and then your main political rivals cause the whole thing shameful, that's when the pressure, it just intensifies significantly. Former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, he delivered some sharp criticism. He characterized these pardons as basically evidence of governance failure, and he questioned the whole decision-making process. Through his spokesperson, Atiku demanded transparency. Who compiled this list? What criteria justified including these kinds of offenders? He described the whole episode as characteristic of reactive rather than proactive governance. Announce a controversial policy, face a backlash, and then make a reversal. And when the reversal finally came, Atiku just called it insufficient and belated. Now, the ruling party, they responded. Supporters dismissed Atiku's criticism, said it was just politically motivated. But Atiku, he wasn't the only critic, because Amnesty International in Nigeria, they issued a public statement. The organization's leadership, they expressed concern that these pardons, they seem to prioritize the offenders over the victims and their families. Amnesty International called for transparency, for meaningful victim participation, and to adhere to human rights standards in these clemency processes. Even civil society groups, they added their own voices. The Inmates Educational Foundation, they questioned the transparency of the whole process, arguing it just raised big concerns about Nigeria's justice system. The Human Rights Writers Association of Nigeria, they called for accountability from the government officials who were involved in this decision. And then the legal community, they started raising constitutional questions. Lawyers were debating, can these clemency decisions even be reversed after they have been officially announced? Were the proper consultation procedures even followed? The impact on drug enforcement, that was significant. The National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, the NDLOA, they have been conducting these extensive operations in recent years. We are talking thousands of arrests, thousands of convictions. Critics argue that pardoning drug offenders, it just undermined all of that effort. It sent the wrong message about the country's commitment to fighting drug trafficking. Even economic analysts weighed in. The Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise, they warned that giving clemency to people convicted of economic crimes, that could affect investor confidence. Consistent application of the law, predictable governance, those are huge factors in investment decisions. The pressure was building from multiple directions: civil society, political opposition, various stakeholders, all questioning the decision. For nearly 3 weeks, publicly, the presidency maintained its position. But behind the scenes, reconsideration was underway. And on October 28, Nigeria will see an announcement that would generate just as much debate as the original decision. October 28, 2025, less than 3 weeks after that initial clemency announcement for 175 people, President Tinubu made a move that was, unprecedented. He issued a revised list, but questions immediately popped up about the constitutional implications. The announcement came from the State House after further consultations and consideration of public feedback. President Tinubu had signed revised instrument of clemency. This new list, it excluded people convicted of drug trafficking, kidnapping, human trafficking, fraud, and unlawful possession of firearms. Different reports, like I said, indicated the new list had somewhere between 86 and 120 beneficiaries, way fewer than the original 175. Maryam Sanda's case, that was revised too. Instead of that full pardon, she will get a sentence commutation. It reduced her death sentence down to 12 years in prison. Now, having already served several years, this meant she would eventually be released sooner than expected, but without that complete exoneration that a presidential pardon gives you. The presidential spokesperson, Bayo Ononoga, he came out and explained it. He said the review, it considered the seriousness and security implications of certain offenses. The government was responsive to concerns from victims, from society, from law enforcement. He also mentioned adherence to obligations, which that could be a reference to the International Cooperation Agreement on Drug Trafficking and Organized Crime. The presidency also announced some structural changes. The Secretariat, that advisory committee on mercy, it will now move from the Ministry of Special Duties over to the Ministry of Justice. New guidelines would require consultations with the prosecuting agencies before any future clemency decisions, and enhanced vetting procedures, they will be implemented. So, the government, they framed this as responsive governance. But then, the constitutional questions, they emerged, and this is a big one. A legal expert, Frank Tietie, he argued publicly that under Nigerian constitutional law, presidential pardons, they may be irreversible, once they are officially granted and gazetted. Now, his interpretation suggested that once those clemency instruments are signed and published, they create vested rights that you cannot retrospectively revoke. If he is correct, this means the president can't just effectively reconvict people who have already been pardoned. Now, if that legal interpretation is valid, the reversal itself could face constitutional challenges. The individuals who were excluded from this new revised list, they might actually have grounds to contest why they are still in detention. Now, public reaction, it was mixed. Some people saw the reversal as, evidence that public pressure, it can influence government decisions. Others, they just characterize it as evidence of, inadequate initial deliberation. And the legal scholars, they were warning about the constitutional precedent being set about the limit and the reversibility of executive clemency power. Now, the reversal was announced, but the legal and political debate, they were just beginning. If pardons truly cannot be reversed once they are granted, what exactly happened on October 28? And if reversals like this on such serious convictions are possible, what does that mean for the stability of Nigeria's entire legal system? To understand the full implications, we have to look at the broader context of justice in Nigeria. So let's go back to that contrast. Why Maryam Sanda, convicted of murder, initially received clemency? Sunday Jackson, that farmer, convicted of killing someone he said was attacking him, he remains on death row. That contrast, it just highlights these massive questions about equity in Nigeria's justice system. Sunday Jackson case, it has gotten a lot of attention. He's a farmer from Adamawa State. He was convicted, sentenced to death for killing a Fulani herder in what he claimed was self-defense during an attack right on his own farm. Now, despite appeals from religious organizations, from human rights groups, online petitions, Jackson is still on death row. His case, it has become this reference point in all of these discussions about selective justice. Critics are asking, why do some convicted individuals get clemency, while others, in arguably more sympathetic circumstances, do not? Another case that is cited frequently is Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra. He has been in detention. His situation is often contrasted with the clemency that was granted to these convicted individuals. And the broader prison situation in Nigeria, it presents huge challenges. According to the data we have, Nigeria's correctional facilities, they are significantly overcrowded, and a substantial portion of the inmates, they are awaiting trials detainees. These are people who haven't even been convicted, but they are just in custody, sometimes for extended periods, for years. Prison reform advocates have been calling for forever to address this backlog, to improve the conditions. Now, this pardon controversy, it just intensified all these existing concerns about equity in the Nigerian justice system. The stated criteria for clemency, that is remorse, good conduct, vocational training, they all sound objective. But critics are questioning, is the application of these criteria consistent, or do factors like wealth, connections, or political influence affect the outcomes? Victims' perspective, they got a lot of attention during this controversy. Biliaminu Bello's family members, the ones who opposed the pardon, they felt their concerns just weren't adequately considered. Families who have been affected by drug trafficking, by other crimes, they are questioning whether their suffering was acknowledged at all in these clemency decisions. Now, Section 175 of the Nigerian Constitution, it grants the president broad authority to grant pardons after consulting the Council of State. Legal scholars are debating the intended scope of this power. Was it meant for just routine use, or was it for, exceptional circumstances, miscarriage of justice, compassionate grants? Now, Nigeria's justice challenges, they are not unique in Africa, because across the continent, presidential clemency powers, they have generated similar debates about accountability, transparency, and equity. And comparing Nigeria's situation to what is happening elsewhere, it reveals some pattern worth looking at. These presidential clemency exercises right across Africa have repeatedly sparked debates about accountability and governance. Nigeria's recent controversy, it just fits right within this broader continental pattern. Look at South Africa. They have seen significant clemency exercises. In December 2019, President Ramaphosa, he granted pardons and remissions to about 14,000 offenders as part of this reconciliation and commemorations. This included both pardons and sentence remissions under different categories. Now, critics, though, including opposition parties like the Democratic Alliance, they questioned the scale, the transparency of that whole process. And earlier, back in 2002, President Thabo Mbeki, he granted pardons to several dozens who were convicted of politically motivated crimes, and that generated controversy at the time. In Kenya, President William Ruto, he has used his clemency powers multiple times. In May 2025, reports indicated pardons for 57 individuals, and each time it generates public discussion about the criteria, about the process. Questions just keep persisting about transparency and whether political considerations are influencing these clemency decisions. Now, Zimbabwe's post-conflict environment that has featured ongoing debates about balancing amnesty with accountability. The country's legal framework, it allows presidential clemency, but civil society groups, they have consistently raised concerns. How do you ensure accountability for serious human rights violations while you are also trying to pursue reconciliation? You see the common patterns emerging across this African context. Clemency processes, they often lack detailed public criteria. Victim participation is typically limited or just absent, and there is frequently this tension between clemency for, say, political offenses and accountability for serious crimes like murder, rape, and corruption. For Nigeria, these issues, they carry extra weight because of the country's regional role. As Africa's largest economy, its most populous nation, Nigeria has historically played this leadership role in ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states. The country has contributed to regional peacekeeping, to mediation efforts. It has advocated for democratic governance in the region. Governance credibility, it affects this leadership capacity. So when Nigeria is facing questions about its own justice system, its own rule of law, it can complicate the country's regional advocacy. International partnerships on law enforcement, drug trafficking, financial crime, those also depend on a consistent application of legal standards. And there are economic implications too, because investors' confidence, foreign direct investment, they are influenced by perception of governance quality, policy consistency, and the rule of law. Now, controversies that raise questions about institutional stability, they can affect economic outcomes. The pattern across Africa, it suggests these presidential clemency systems, they need reform to ensure transparency, to ensure victim participation, and to have clear criteria. Nigeria's reversal, it might indicate that public accountability mechanisms can work, but whether this represents some lasting institutional change or just temporary crisis management, well, that remains to be seen. So President Tinubu reversed course and he announced reforms. But the key question remains, do they represent genuine institutional improvement, or are they just temporary responses to public pressure? The announced reforms, they have potential significance because moving that clemency secretariat from the Ministry of Special Duties over to the Ministry of Justice, that could bring greater legal expertise into the process. Now, the new guidelines requiring consultation with prosecuting agencies before clemency, that could improve the flow of information. Now, plans for enhanced vetting, that could strengthen the processes. But it's the implementation that will determine whether these reforms are meaningful. The fundamental structure, it remains. Nigerian presidents, they retain this broad discretion under Section 175 of the Constitution. There are very limited explicit constitutional constraints on that clemency power. Victims, they have no guaranteed participation rights in the process, and legislative and judicial oversight, it's minimal. And those constitutional questions, they just add complexity. If those legal interpretations that pardons are irreversible, if those prove correct, then the individuals who were excluded from that revised list, they might have standing to challenge their continued detention. This could generate litigation that reaches the higher court and establishes a binding precedent on the scope and limits of presidential clemency power. Now, the international dimensions, they matter for Nigeria because the country maintains agreement with other nations on drug trafficking, financial crimes, law enforcement. Now, consistency in applying legal standards affects these partnerships. That phrase, adherence to bilateral obligations in the official statement, it suggests the international considerations. They did influence this reversal. Regional leadership is also affected. Nigeria's capacity to advocate for democratic governance, for rule of law, for anti-corruption measures in ECOWAS, it depends in part on its own governance credibility. Now, perceptions of institutional weakness or inconsistent policy implementation, those can complicate regional influence. And economically, governance perceptions, they influence investment decisions. Now, no single event determines investment flows, but patterns of policy consistency, of institutional stability, they do affect sovereign risk assessment and investor confidence over time. Politically, you can bet this episode will feature in future electoral contests. Opposition parties, they can point to it as evidence of inadequate deliberation. The governing party, they can argue it demonstrates responsiveness to public concerns. Which narrative prevails, that will depend partly on whether these announced reforms are actually implemented and sustained. Now, the fundamental questions, they remain unresolved. In democracies, executive clemency, that power, it serves important purposes, correcting injustices, showing mercy in exceptional circumstances. But how should this power be structured? How should it be constrained? How can victim interests be protected? How can transparency and accountability be ensured? These questions, they don't have simple answers, but they are essential for healthy democratic governance. The clemency list, it has been reversed. Reforms have been announced, but those deeper questions about power, about accountability, and about justice, they remain. In any democratic system, who ensures the checks on executive authority? When president exercises mercy, how are victim interests protected? And when policies face this kind of intense criticism, how do institutions learn and adapt? Nigeria's clemency controversy, it has concluded its immediate phase, but that broader conversation about justice, governance, and democratic accountability, that continues. Now, if you have watched to this point, I want to say a very big thank you to you. You are the reason why we are doing this, because our job here is to inform you, to bring you the stories with the kind of details mainstream media doesn't dare to attempt. This is Frontline Africa. We talk about geopolitics here. We say it from Africa's own point of view. And this matter has been raising dust, a lot of dust in Nigeria ever since it was announced in early October. Now it has been reversed. And the question is this: do you think this will reflect well in his decision-making process going forward? Because President Tinubu, he prides himself as this guy that is very talented in recruiting the best brains in his government. But what we are seeing so far, for this list to make it to the final stage and announced publicly, some people went through it. Is it that these people are incompetent, or they don't just care about what anybody can say? But thank God that Nigerians spoke out and the pushback, it worked. And that is why this issue of pushing back to executive rascality should be normalized in any democracy, especially in Nigeria. If we can continue pushing back in anything that the executive does that we don't like, maybe we can be getting some kind of reversals like this, and it is good for democracy and it is good for Nigeria. Now go to the comment section and drop your opinion on this matter. Tell us what you think about this whole thing, especially on the issue of drug dealers and murderers, especially drug dealers, because Nigeria has a reputation out there on the international stage about our people always convicted of drug trafficking outside Nigeria. And this is not reflecting well on all of us whenever we face embassy interviews for visa applications. Now, if Nigerian government pardons drug traffickers, what is it saying on our reputation on the international community? These are the issues. Go to the comment section and tell us your opinion. Now, if you want to see more of my videos, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.